As we prepare to hear the parable that Julie just referenced for us, I invite you to pray together, asking that God's Spirit will help us to understand this story that Jesus told. The prayer is on your screen or in your bulletin. Join me in prayer. Loving God, search us out with your tireless Spirit. Find us with your clear voice. Heal us with your loving embrace. Through Jesus Christ, the one you sent for all who are lost. Amen. In Luke 15, there are three parables. The parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, or maybe you know it better as the parable of the prodigal son. I'm going to read the first two, the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. You probably know the parable of the prodigal son, but I invite you to read that on your own later today. You could even pause this video and read it now. Hear now the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Or, what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." This is the gospel of our Lord. Praise be to Christ. I've brought with me today a bowl of M&Ms. And I have a question for you. Say this was your bowl of M&Ms. If I ate one, would you notice it was missing? What if I ate two? Would you notice that these were missing? Those are good. If you did notice, would you care? Let me show you the bowl again. It's still full. Would you care that 2 or 3 were missing? There's so many more left in the bowl. Jesus tells us 3 stories that ask us to think about the same question. Do you notice what's missing? Or who is missing? And do you care? These 3 stories are traditionally called the stories of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. They are stories about lost things. All of us have lost things along the way. We've turned the house upside down, retraced our steps. We've gone back miles to find what we lost: a wallet, keys, a ring. Somehow, in our house, we lost our dog's collar with all the tags on it over a year ago, and we have yet to find it. My neighbor, well, every couple of weeks, he loses his dog. So we hear his voice ring out through the neighborhood, calling, "Arlo, Arlo." We all lose things. The poet Elizabeth Bishop describes losing things as the arc of life itself. She says it's the one art that we learn to master from birth to death. Her poem begins, "The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster." As she tells it, the losing begins with keys, then places and names, then a keepsake watch. And the pace of losing grows faster and faster until eventually we lose everything, even the ones we love. Elizabeth Bishop's poem is darkly ironic, and when you read it, you feel a sense of powerlessness and indifference in the face of loss. There's nothing you can do. But these stories that Jesus tells about lost things offers a more hopeful future than that poem. You see, Jesus is inviting us, even challenging us, to notice what is lost, and especially who is lost. To learn to notice and to count, and then to do something about it. During the month of July in our worship, we're listening to the parables of Jesus and exploring them in preaching, music, and art. They're guiding our virtual art camp that many of us are participating in this month, and I hope you'll participate too. These stories Jesus told are among the best-known stories in the world. Our guide through these stories is a scholar named Amy Jill Levine, or AJ as she's known. A.J. Levine is a senior New Testament scholar. She's a professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She's the author of the book Short Stories by Jesus, and she's a devout Jew. Levine is not a Christian, but she has made it her life's work to study the Jewish rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, to unpack the New Testament writings about him and the time in which he lived, and to weed out the implicit and explicit anti-Semitic interpretations that have accrued over the years and that often we don't even notice. In this book, Short Stories by Jesus, Levine interprets the parables and asks us to hear these familiar stories from the lips of a masterful Jewish rabbi named Jesus and listen to them with the ears of a first-century Jewish audience. It's a fascinating invitation to explore these familiar parables from a different point of view. In A.J. Levine's reading, the three parables in Luke 15 are not so much about lost things, but about three people who lose something very precious. What we call the parable of the lost sheep, she says is really not about lost sheep. The sheep simply went missing, as sheep tend to do, like my neighbor's dog. Maybe the sheep was hungry or thirsty or curious about what was over the next hill. It doesn't matter why the sheep left. It wasn't the sheep's fault. The sheep is not the focus. The shepherd is the one to watch. The shepherd lost the sheep and left the 99 in the open country to go and find the sheep. And when he found it, he brought that sheep home on his shoulders. In the same way, the parable of the lost coin is not really about a lost coin. The coin went missing, like car keys go missing, and reading glasses, and watches, and rings, and remotes. The one to watch is the woman who lost it. She turned her house upside down. She herself. She was a wealthy woman, but she did not leave this task to maids or housekeepers or servants. She herself lifted every cushion, moved every rug, swept every corner until the coin was found. And the parable of the prodigal son, or the lost son, well, you guessed it. It's not actually about the son at all. It's a story about a father who lost a son, two sons, in fact. We all remember from the story that he lost the younger son to wild living in a far-off country. But while he was paying attention to that younger son who was away, watching the road for his return, he lost his other son to envy and resentment and feelings of being neglected and unappreciated. Losing things is hard enough. Losing people is much more complicated. But even this parable is not about the sons that were lost, either one of them. The person to watch in this parable is the father. When the younger son appeared on the road, the father didn't wait for him to arrive. He ran out to meet him, and he showered him with kisses of welcome. And when the older son did not come to the party that he threw for the younger son, the father noticed that he was missing. He went out to the field to convince his older son to join the party. That brings us to the heart of these stories about people who lose things. Because we're not talking about things at all. We're talking about people. Jesus is talking about our relationships, our community, about the wholeness of our human fabric. What do we do when we realize that People are missing in our lives, even if it's only one out of a crowd. The reason Jesus tells these stories is because tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear him teach. But the religious leaders were grumbling that this man eats with sinners. These religious leaders wanted to believe that they could live a good life while being separated from their brothers and sisters. They wanted to believe that they could be righteous while being alienated from one another. Jesus told these stories because he wanted them to notice who was missing from the community and to care so much they would go to any lengths to restore the relationship. Instead of dismissing these tax collectors as a hopeless cause, Jesus wanted them to leave everything and turn the house upside down to restore those relationships. Instead of writing off these sinners as a lost cause, Jesus wanted them to imagine the joy and the celebration when the relationship was whole and they could all sit down at the table together. What will you do, Jesus asks, when you realize that someone very precious is missing in your life? Do you notice? When you do notice, to what lengths will you go to make it whole again? Will you give it up for lost? Or will you hold out the hope of a great celebration and work to make it happen? In the last few months, we've been taking stock in different ways of the relationships that we have. Staying at home has helped us with that. We've had time to notice our family and friends in new ways, to take stock of the relationships we have with a spouse or a child at home or a grown child who lives far away, with friends we haven't talked to in years or neighbors that we never saw. Because the busyness and activity of our lives has slowed down, we've had a chance to count the sheep, count the coins, count the people. The question Jesus asks is, when we count and something is missing, what will we do? Years ago, my friend Jerry used to come to the weekly men's group I was part of and talk about his daughter that he had lost. She hadn't died. She was alive. She had children and a family, but they had no relationship. It was through no fault of hers. In fact, it was all his fault. In her childhood, he had allowed his alcoholism and workaholism to wreck their family life. When he finally came to his senses and began recovery, he realized that he had lost his daughter. But he did not write the relationship off. Like the shepherd who went searching for the sheep, he kept looking. Every week for years, he called and left a message on her phone. I'm just calling to say hello, to tell you I love you, and I hope you're well. He never got a call back. Until one day, out of the blue, he got a call inviting him to come to a birthday party for one of his grandchildren. There was no deep conversation, no unpacking years of hurt, just an invitation. He drove down to the party, met her husband for the first time, and his grandchildren, and his daughter, after so many years. There were no apologies asked for or given, though he was ready. They simply celebrated the resurrection of the relationship. What will you do when a relationship is missing and you notice? Will you go in search of it? Will you turn everything upside down to find it? Will you hold out the hope of a resurrection celebration? We've also had time in the last month to take stock of our national relationships and the people and cultures and colors that are missing from the way that we tell our national story. Here's part of my story. When I was about 12, my uncle gave me a book I never read. My uncle worked at a university. He was the family's resident intellectual. So for Christmas that year, when I was 12 years old, he gave me the book A Different Mirror by Ronald Takaki. The book had just come out back then in 1993. My uncle loved it, and he thought I should read it too. I read the first chapter. It began with Takaki, who is a multi-generational Asian American, in a cab, and the taxi driver turns and asks, "Where are you from?" Of course, he was from San Francisco. In the rest of the book, Takaki tells a different story of American history, a more complete story, a story where America has many cultures and many colors. But do you want to know the truth? I never finished the book. It stayed on my shelf for 15 more years until I gave it away. About a year ago, Caitlin bought that book to help teach our children a more complete story about American history. And when I saw it sitting on the table fresh from Amazon, I realized my loss. I had that book 25 years ago and didn't read it. I don't blame myself for it, but it was something I lost. I lost an opportunity to be more whole, more complete, to be part of a larger community and fabric, and now I need to do something about that. I'm not the only one who has not learned the full story of American history and the full story of Americans of every color and culture. In this conversation we've been having as a nation and as a congregation for weeks now, we're realizing, some of us for the first time, what we've lost. We're counting the sheep in the field and the coins in the stack, and even more, we're counting up the people in our lives and realizing that some aren't there. Their stories, their faces, their colors and cultures, their music, their art, their accomplishments are missing from our lives and from our stories. We need to do something about that. What will we do about it, Jesus asks? Will we go searching? Will we hold in our hearts the hope of a great celebration? And if we find what we're missing, will we throw a party and invite all of our friends? You see, the good news of the gospel is that nothing and no one is lost to God. The God who found Hagar and her son Ishmael in the wilderness, the God who found Abraham and Sarah in their old age, the God who found Joseph in a pit abandoned by his brothers, the God who found Jacob asleep on a rock, the God who found Moses at the burning bush, and the God who found Israel enslaved in Egypt, the God who found Elijah depressed in the wilderness, the God who found Mary pondering thoughts in her heart, and the God who found Joseph tossing in his sleep, the God who found Jesus on the cross and in the tomb. No one is lost to this God. The God of Israel, the God of Jesus, is the one who seeks and finds and restores and rejoices. The good news of the gospel is that in God's time, all the lost will be found and all will be gathered in, even the ones we can't find, even the relationships we can't heal. God will make well. But in the meantime, Jesus asks, will we notice what is lost? And when we notice, will we care? Will we go searching? Will we carry in our hearts the hope of a great celebration?